Thanks for the fabulous introduction. This was fun. It's great to have all of you here this morning. You know, architecture is such a neat field, and the world of green buildings and architecture and sustainability has become a bigger and bigger part of our conversation across the country. And so we're delighted to be actually leading the conversation in Edmonton and also leading the conversation across Canada and a little bit around the world. So what we're up to here, I think, is really important, and I'm really glad that you guys came, and I love the fact, Brendan, that you guys created this theme called reuse. So what Brandon didn't tell you is that this Creative Mornings group, your thing is doing some funky things, but as soon as it's done that, we'll start talking from the presentation. Yeah, no, I like view presenter tools. If we can do that, yeah, that'd be awesome. So it's interesting that Creative Mornings sets these themes, and I guess what I understand from Brendan is that the theme is the same across all the 40 chapters. So there's like 40 places all across North America all talking about reuse today. So that's, I think, really remarkable because it changes the conversation, right? It talks about how we reuse things and what we're doing in the world. And of course, my personal take on it is in the world of buildings. Now, reuse, of course, can apply to any of a number of other fields, but I'm going to talk about architecture because that's what we do. And we've had a lot of fun designing neat, green, sustainable buildings for well, I'm not even going to admit to you for how long, but for a long time anyways. Longer than I'm going to tell you. But we have been doing that, and as we move through the world of sustainable buildings, we realize more and more that the built environment really has to be addressed in terms of existing buildings. So today I want to talk a little bit about this initiative that we started at our office called Reimagine, which is really focused on what are we doing with existing buildings and how, when we're thinking about sustainability, how are existing buildings part of the mix? So I really think we need to be talking about reusing buildings, we need to be talking about reusing materials, we need to be talking about refreshing building interiors. This is a great example of an old space that's repurposed. And we need to be talking about how that revitalizes our city. And those are the things I wanted to touch on this morning. And then we can have a bit of a conversation about them. So I guess the first question really is, why are we worried about that? Well, I guess the answer is pretty obvious, right? We have to be worried about construction waste. We have to be worried about buildings that get torn down, both because of the legacy that we lose and the memory that we lose, and because of the material environment and the fact that those things that they call throwing things away, there's a bit of a problem with that, right? Where is away anyways? Anybody know where away is? No, eh? Yeah, I was having that problem too. So this is not a new agenda. I mean, in this little pie chart here that you can't really see, construction waste is about 20% of all the waste in our landfills. That's a pretty significant amount. Government's been paying attention to that. Maybe 15 years ago, we did a study for Alberta Environment saying, you know, what are you going to do about construction waste? How do you reduce it? Through design, through construction. Government even came out with a strategy called Too Good to Waste. So Alberta taking the lead, not bad. So there is a lot of work being done on getting rid of construction waste in the landfill. However, our attitudes towards existing buildings still have a long way to go. And I think our opportunity here is to really rethink what we think of existing buildings. This is a good example, a building that we completed here in the city a number of years ago. It's the East Edmonton Primary Care Centre. One line that you might want to remember is the greenest building is the building that already exists. Why is that true? Well, we'll talk a little bit about that. But this was an interesting story because when we were first hired by Capital Health, they basically said to us, well, this little old schoolhouse there, it's kind of in our way, we don't really want it. So can we design a new health center, please, and can you make that school go away? And we said, well, really? Is that what you actually want us to do? Is you want us to build a whole new 60,000 square foot building on this site and tear down this little building? So we did some community engagement, and of course the community didn't see it that way at all. What do you think the community said? Keep the building, keep the trees, right? Build the building, no worries. Keep the building, keep the trees. So this article showed up in the Edmonton Journal. Health center objections smoothed over. Yeah, we calmed the community down and said, you know what, we actually will listen. We actually will consider whether we could use this building. We got Capital Health on board. They agreed to let us actually do the study to see whether we could integrate the existing building. We did. The existing building is integrated. If you drive by on 112th Avenue, you'll see it. So what we were able to do was take a 60,000 square foot program, put 15,000 square feet in the old 15,000 square foot building, build only 45,000 square feet, stick the parking underground. Everybody was happy. So it was a little bit of a trick to do that because it took basically shifting the paradigm, but it was important because now the city's going to get to keep this building for another 100 years. It was one of the only schools built in Alberta in the 30s. So pretty neat and important building. Little tiny, 8 classroom school. Pretty important though for our history and to retain that legacy. And pretty important that it has a new purpose. So historic buildings are one set of things, and I think a lot of people would agree that if you can keep historic buildings, they should be kept. And yet, even as recently as a couple of weeks ago, the city was talking about the Rossdale power plant, and should it be kept or not? Well, if you have any opportunity to talk to your friends at City Council, tell them it should be, because there's no excuse for tearing buildings down. There really isn't. And then, of course, there's modern buildings, right? And what are we doing with modern buildings? I mean, this is, of course, Toronto City Hall, a legacy building of the modern era. But there are many buildings that are not nearly as beautiful or as iconic. So in Toronto, a number of people started an initiative called the Mayor's Tower Renewal Initiative, which, in fact, we had the Mayor of Toronto here speaking about, I guess it's almost 5 years ago now when we started our reimagine strategy. And the Mayor of Toronto was saying, he's behind towers in Toronto being reimagined, being reskinned, being repurposed to extend the life of buildings. So they've launched a whole initiative in the City of Toronto to try to encourage owners of buildings, whether they're private sector or public sector owners, to do something with their existing towers. We need to be doing stuff like that here too. Even the Empire State Building is being reimagined. It's being improved in terms of its energy performance, because these existing buildings, they can be enhanced, right? They can be dramatically improved. You can increase their energy performance a lot. And it's amazing what happens when you do that. You can really extend the life, reduce the environmental footprint, and increase the quality of indoor environment for people. Some of these older buildings aren't very comfortable to be in, right? They're leaky, they're cold, they're not efficiently insulated, so we can fix them. Even the Bank of Montreal Tower in Toronto was reskinned recently with a new building envelope. So there's a lot of opportunity to be doing some of that kind of stuff here. And there's even great examples from all over the world. I wanted to show you, for example, I was in Vienna a few years ago, and here they are reskinning the Ministry of Finance. Now, if the Ministry of Finance thinks this is a good idea, maybe we should be paying attention, right? Like, they're probably not the radical fringe, So they're reskinning this existing precast concrete building, and you can see what they're up to. That little square panel in the middle is a module where they did a mock-up, so they tested that. This presentation will be online, I think, afterwards, so you're welcome to actually see the whole thing afterwards. But you can see what they're doing is they're taking this old building and they're reskinning the entire thing. And I think there's an opportunity all over Edmonton to be reskinning existing buildings. And we've developed a really cool team of experts in our shop just to do exactly that, because we think that Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, all over North America, this business of reskinning existing buildings is going to be the next wave in sustainability. Another example from Vienna. Now here's more of the radical fringe. OPEC. The world headquarters of OPEC. They reskinned their building. So gotta love that. So that just really tells us that all over the world, people are starting to pay attention to existing buildings and to how we can reimagine them. And right here in town, somebody was mentioning about our funky penthouse, so I'm going to share a few things about reimagining some buildings that are sort of small, medium, large, and extra large here in the city to show you what I think is possible. And then we'll talk a little bit about reusing building materials as well. So there's the Cambridge penthouse. Well, when I and my colleagues went to do a reimagine study for the Cambridge Lofts building, we found this penthouse. And this is what it looked like. It was basically an empty mechanical room that had been left behind in the conversion of this building into condos. So essentially it was an office building, it was condo converted, the penthouse was gutted, and there it sat for about a decade. That's what it looked like. So that's what it looks like today. So that's my kitchen. You get to be voyeurs today. Look inside our world. This is what the outside of it looked like. This was the beautiful metal cladding on the outside of the mechanical room. It was very elegant. And that's kind of what it looks like today. These photos are mostly done by Garth Crump, who's here in the room. So we want to give credit to our great photography team in our shop, and thank you, Garth. This is what the interior of what's now my living room looked like. A beautiful piece of modern sculpture, aka the ducts, in just running through this kind of rather unsightly drywalled two-story high space. And that's what that space looks like today. So we rather love living there. It's got a pretty spectacular view, and it's a pretty fun space to hang out. And one last shot just to give you a flavor for it. So there's that lovely exterior cladding once more. You get the sense of this really elegant space that we acquired. So it was a bit of a project to convince my husband that we were going to buy a view lot. However, today it looks like this. And actually, that's a photograph done by a local photographer here of the Manasc Isaac Partners. So that's our team. We're about a 50-person architectural and engineering firm here in the city. So we've got 6 partners. That's the 6 of us. Some of you might know Shafraz Kaba, who's the fellow on the right side of the screen there, or Richard Isaacs, some of our partners. Another building that we reimagined here in the city, which I think you might be aware of, is the old Dell building. Anybody seen this place? Yeah, a few people have. So kind of a little funny backstory. We've been working out at the Edmonton Research Park designing new research lab and office buildings for a number of different high-tech companies. And over those years, we probably did all the newer buildings on that campus. And then this Dell thing showed up, and a number of people said to me, "Did you guys do that?" And I went, No, it's awful. No, we did not have anything to do with this. Dell just came in. We didn't even know about it. They came in with some drawings from a project they had built in Oklahoma, and overnight they built it. It was like strange. Anyway, they built it, they came, they saw, they conquered, good old Dell. They decided that they were done with the call center when the Canadian dollar went up. That was it. They were done, right? So their only agenda of being in Edmonton was that the Canadian dollar was so low that they could hire people to do call center stuff for them for cheap. And when that was no longer true, they were no longer interested. So that was the end of Dell. They sold the building to the Servus credit union. So Servus called us up one day and said, "Guess what? We just bought this building." So we said, "Okay, well, we'll go out and have a look at it." So this is what we did: is we did some thermal scans. When we do a reimagine study, we do the diagnostics. We look at the thermal conditions of the building. We look at some of the challenges that the building envelope faces, and then we put together a plan for how we can improve this building and make it durable and sustainable. So we did that. And we came up with a concept for how to reimagine that building, how to make the exterior of it better insulated, better glass, better performance. We put in windows that open, we put in sunshades, we did all sorts of fun things. And more importantly, the interior. This is what it looked like when we got it. Yeah, exactly. Not exactly where you'd put your corporate head office if you had a choice, right? But it was a call center, so hey, what can you say? It was a call center. That's what it looks like today. So what we did was we cut basically a hole in the donut. And so we put a clear story in the roof, brought some daylight into the middle, cut some holes in the floors. Imagine we had to convince a bunch of bankers to reduce the amount of square feet that they'd bought. That was kind of fun. But we convinced them that this was worthwhile because the daylight was worth more than the square feet. That's an interesting argument to make to bankers. But it worked, and we created this fabulous space for them, and they rather love it. And in fact, they're just about bursting at the seams. It's also a training center for them, so that's pretty cool. And yeah, this is when we were transforming the exterior. So we basically re-insulated. You can see out there the old brick being covered up with girts and insulation and new cladding, and the glass being changed out. And we were able to integrate their corporate colors into it, so it gave it a little bit more life, and some sunshades, and it's all good. And based on that, we were able to get some pretty good energy savings too. So the bonus is not only do you get a great working environment and a nicer place that looks good on the outside, so you get the inside looking better, the outside looking better, and you save the energy. So 3 for the price of 1. There are a few towers around Edmonton that we've also been talking about reimagining. So far they haven't gone ahead, but we hope that they will eventually. The one that I'll show you is Associated Engineering Plaza, and this one we think might go ahead one of these years. You know, a lot of these towers depend on tenants, but that's the vision for that particular one. So it could look very different than it did before, and really enhance the city and add more daylight into the building. Lots we can do with existing towers. And then there's really great examples of what you can do with other existing buildings. This is a proposed redevelopment in London at Battersea Park. This is actually by a firm called Raphael Vignoli Architects. And it's an old energy plant, obviously, and it's being converted into a conference center and housing. So ideas about our old power plant, if we could figure out what to do with Rossdale. You know, I think the city is very interested in that, but there's also a move afoot to tear it down. So if you want to do some advocacy, this is your opportunity. Even from an environmental impact perspective, so using existing buildings makes sense from so many perspectives, right? Looks better, feels better, and you reduce your footprint. This particular graphic, which you really can't see, but I just wanted to show you, there was a study called actually The Greenest Building, interestingly enough, which was done by the Heritage Preservation Lab. And what they did was they compared the environmental impact on a number of metrics, so on climate change, on resource depletion, on human health, and on ecosystem quality. So those are the 4 things, and across a variety of different building types. And so the gray bar is building a new building, and the colored bar is repurposing an existing building. So you can see how much less the environmental impact is on all of those different metrics. And not that you need to know the metrics, but it's interesting to know that these studies are being done, and that there is a lot of research that says, you know what, we really can reduce our environmental impact if we look after our existing building stock and do intelligent things with it. In fact, that same study said that you can take between 10 and 80 years for a new building to a new building being 30% more energy efficient than standard to catch up with an existing building. Between 10 and 80 years. It's a lot. Construction materials. I just want to touch on construction materials, and I know my partner Shafraz Kaba was talking about that at TEDx. So there's reimagining existing buildings, but then there are buildings that are deconstructed. So what do we do with those existing materials? Well, sometimes we try to salvage them. This is actually Garth's video from just a couple of days ago. A bunch of guys in our office, led by Garth, were taking apart the gym floor at Nate and salvaging it and storing it in our office building, just so that we have it for some future purpose. That's one of the challenges with existing buildings, is that they're they never come down at a time when you need them. But there's more and more companies that are starting to figure out that if you warehouse stuff and you provide good inventories online, all those materials become available. So this is our office in Calgary, the Reimagined Interiors office, and it's all done with repurposed building materials. You can see the flooring, the walls, everything is all constructed with repurposed building materials. And we have a good connection with some people in Calgary who are working on deconstructing existing buildings. Also in Calgary, when we designed the new Emergency Operations Center, we were able to salvage all the beams from the pre-existing building on that site. We've even done projects where we've cut down trees on the site and used the trees from the site to use for columns in the building. In Slave Lake, when we built it the first time, this is the Slave Lake Government Center and Library, so the post-fire reconstruction. You probably all heard about the fire in Slave Lake. We're rebuilding this building. It's almost looking like this again, but this is what it looked like a few years ago before it burnt down. The first time around, all of those glulam sunshades that are on the outside were deconstructed out of a church that came down here in Edmonton. The glulam was no longer structurally sound, so we used it as sunshades so that it would be safe and effective. And the fun part was that in the reconstruction, of course, we didn't get to do that the second time because we didn't have glulam, but we did. There were also some church pews from the same church there in the courthouse in Slave Lake, and they did survive the fire. So they're still there. And on the second go-around, we had to put in a temporary boiler room and washrooms because of the phasing of the reconstruction. And so we have a brand new boiler and plumbing fixtures, and we've just figured out how to repurpose that boiler and plumbing fixtures for a little museum project that we're doing in Wainwright. So we're always trying to connect the dots and see if we can take something from one, something that's surplus to somebody and put it somewhere else that's useful to somebody else. So we're always sort of thinking that way, and I think that's a neat kind of strategy all the time, always to be looking for opportunities for reusing things. So the last slide I've got is just to show you that some artists are even having way more fun than we get to have, because as architects we have to be somewhat responsible, but the artists don't. So here's an artist in Seoul, Korea, and he's done a reskinning of a tower using old doors. So I thought that was rather a fun slide to leave you with as a closing thought. And because there's lots of these mid-rise buildings, so it shows you that you can do very conservative things to reimagine existing buildings, or you can do very fun things, or anything in between. So just to close, I'd love to hear your questions, your comments, your thoughts, and glad you're all here.
I was going to say, I love buildings, don't you? I love looking at cool pictures of awesome buildings, and it's fantastic that we get to see some of this. But I hope you get the sense that that term that they're using, reimagine, doesn't have to just apply to buildings. And I think you were kind of hinting at that, Vivian, that it's really a way of looking at stuff. And what you can do with it. And so yeah, we're going to open the floor, and then I'll pass this back, but that's my 2 cents. And I get to do that because I am...
You're the guy.
Yeah.
You're the guy. Excellent. All right. So do we have a microphone for people on the floor to ask questions? No.
No, we don't. So just
okay.
Be loud.
Be loud. Okay. And I can repeat the questions, too, because I think they're recording all of this. So, yeah, please, questions. Anybody? Yeah, for sure.
I know there's a movement with sort of product design and furniture design where they're looking at the deconstruction of it well before they actually construct it.
Right. So
Is there a similar sort of fashion when you're looking at, I guess, new architecture?
that's a really good question. Architecture for deconstruction is being paid attention to, definitely. And there are lots of people who are working on ideas of how to deconstruct buildings. It's more difficult in our climate than it is in a milder climate because our buildings have to be sealed so tight in order to deal with our cold extremes. So nonetheless, building for deconstruction, one of the things that we're seeing more and more is for sure things like demountable partitions, instead of say drywall walls, using demountable walls and so on. So there's a lot more of that happening. But actually designing a full building for deconstruction is possible. It's difficult and expensive. So people don't do it unless they have a really, really good reason to do. More questions? Yeah. Dan. Mm-hmm.
But just thoughts or to speak to the idea of the cost savings of like a landfill and 20% of that being filled. So
Mm-hmm.
this is the triple bottom line idea.
Right.
And what type of policy initiatives are in place right now or people working on that you're aware of that are, I guess, trying to help change that, help shed light on actually what the real cost savings or real cost is of changing material versus retiming.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The sort of question of full cost accounting, right? How do you really account for how much environmental impact there really is in new materials versus old? And it's tricky because, of course, part of that full cost accounting is accounting for the labor of what people do. And of course, unfortunately, as we know, in many parts of the world, labor is very cheap. And here, labor tends to be quite expensive. So you have to be a little bit imaginative about how the full cost accounting is done, because if you take labor at a rate that's a North American rate, you get one result, and if you take labor at a rate that's a Chinese rate, you get a different result, right? But then there's all the environmental impacts as well. And they're also hard to quantify because nobody actually says, oh, well, you'll have to pay for the landfill. Interestingly, I mean, certainly in certain industries, like in car manufacturing, for example, they really started to make the subcontractors and suppliers all the way down the supply chain responsible for the end of life of their product. And in building materials too, we're seeing cradle to cradle certification where building materials and products are required to be sort of reclaimed by the manufacturer at the end of their life. It's a good theory. So far, it hasn't really been easy to implement because the North American market is so diffuse and the ownership of buildings changes hands, and so it's hard to implement those ideas even though they make a lot of sense. In truth, I think we have to change our attitude first, and then the cost accounting will follow. Accounting is always a rear view mirror activity, right? And so accounting looks backwards at, what have we done and how shall we put it down on paper. Thinking is a forward-looking, or design is a forward-looking activity. So I guess what we're suggesting is if we think like designers, if we think forward-looking, the rear view mirror will follow and we'll figure it out as we move forward. But we do need to be a lot smarter about how we think about materials and just sort of not assuming that, oh, well, we'll just demolish that and it'll go away because the demolition contract will take it away. Well, really? Maybe not, right? Maybe we need to take more responsibility for that. And, some of the kind of surrogate measures that are used are things like tipping fees at the landfill, right? But it's never enough to be a real disincentive. It has to start with an attitude and a desire to reuse materials, and an attitude where actually the effort that it takes to reuse those materials is worthwhile. Interesting anecdote from Winnipeg, actually. A number of years ago, the Mountain Equipment Co-op folks bought a couple of old buildings right on Portage, not far from Maine. So great location for their new flagship Winnipeg retail store. But it had these rather old, rather small, not very functional 3-story brick buildings on that site. And I think there were 3 buildings, maybe even 4. And they didn't really know what to do with them because they didn't really meet their needs. And they couldn't just renovate the buildings because their retail store needed big space because, they've got to fit canoes and big stuff. So they needed to build a new store, and they really didn't know what to do. And they worked with a design team, architects, colleagues of mine in Winnipeg, who said, well, you know what if we deconstruct the building and inventory all the materials, so bricks over here, lumber, they had beams and columns just like we have here, deconstruct all of that, stack it all up on site, inventory it, and then we'll design the new building based on the materials we have. So that was kind of a cool idea. But then they said, but it's going to be awfully expensive to take all that brick and clean it. You know, it's going to cost way more than just buying new brick. Why don't we just go buy new brick? And the architect said, you know what? I have an idea. Why don't we call Habitat for Humanity and see if they can help us? So here's what happened, was the brick with all its mortar on it and stuff was given to Habitat for Humanity for free. Now, Habitat for Humanity has lots of volunteers. They have a lot more manpower than they have money. So they put their volunteers to work cleaning bricks, and the deal was, once the bricks were cleaned, the Mountain Equipment Co-op folks would buy them for full retail. Like, they'd buy them as if they were new bricks, because they were going to need bricks anyways. So they bought them for full retail. Habitat for Humanity got the cash, and they got to keep whatever was left over that wasn't needed. So it was sort of a really good deal, because, you know, Habitat for Humanity got what they needed, which was cash, but they had lots of volunteer labor. Mountain Equipment Co-op got what they needed, which was clean bricks, and everybody got them at a price that they could afford. So sometimes you just got to think outside of the box in terms of the supply chain and figure out who's got what resource to add into the mix, right? And sometimes it's free labor and sometimes it's something else. But that resulted in the entire new Mountain Equipment Co-op store in Winnipeg is all built out of repurposed materials. So if you go there, if you find yourself in Winnipeg, go check it out. If you look up at the ceiling, you'll notice something interesting. You'll notice that instead of all the wood joists going in the same direction like they do in a new building, theirs go in all sorts of funny directions, because they had to work with what they had. So even their wood joists, like they had, you know, some of them were only 6 feet long, so they had to span them the other way, and some of them were 14 feet long, so they had to span them the other way. And so they just kind of mixed and matched their design architecturally and structurally. They designed the building based on the materials at hand, so it was an inventory thing. So it was kind of cool. They had a good construction manager who did a really nice inventory for them and said, you know, here's what you got. You got, you know, 27 2x12s that are 8 feet long, and you got 38 2x10s that are 9 feet long, and there you go. So you take that and then you design backwards from that. It's a bit more work, but it's worth it, right? Because you get this great result. So there's lots of great anecdotes about success stories that have been done across Canada with repurposing materials. Yeah.
I imagine being sort of on the frontier of green design and architecture that you have to be pretty experimental.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, I've been thinking a lot about willingness to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, you've heard some great success stories, but do you have any sort of mistakes that you'd like to share and how you've learned from them, or other people's mistakes that you've learned from them?
That's a good question. You know, experimental is true, and at the same time, a lot of what we do we know can work, and so it's very actually rare that we end up with real mistakes that can't be easily kind of corrected. We most often, the challenge is in pushing the envelope, the challenge is in getting our clients on board to get them to let us do things that we are pretty sure are going to work. And pretty much when we get the kind of green light, stuff does tend to work. So experimental, you know, the buildings world it's not rocket science, right? And we do our own research, we do mock-ups. Sometimes we test things and just do mock-ups and tweak them. But it isn't rocket science, right? It's not like you're experimenting with, you know, what happens when you know, put some kind of new chemicals in the petri dish and out comes penicillin. Like, it's really, buildings are not quite like that. So, I mean, we are assembling known things, materials that have somewhat known properties, and usually it does kind of work. So the experimentation, it's really design type of experimentation rather than stuff that tends to fail most of the time. Well, there's the odd time where things don't work quite the way we would like them to, but generally speaking, things work out pretty well, I'd say. Sometimes we can experiment with things that are a little bit more, I mean, one thing that I'm experimenting with on my penthouse, which is maybe more something I wouldn't do for a client, but I would do for myself, is that one of the interesting things on the penthouse is that it's passively heated. In other words, there's a big elevator machine room, and that generates a lot of waste heat. And so my whole penthouse doesn't have a heating system in it. So that's a bit of an experiment to see how that works. And if it doesn't really work well enough, I'll add a heating system in. So that's the kind of failure that would happen. Is it's not really a failure, it's just, well, I'll have to add in something that I've chosen to leave out for the moment. And so that's often what we'll tend to do is, like, in some buildings you'll say, oh, well, you don't need any mechanical cooling. And the owner will say, well, yeah, I want air conditioning. And we'll say, well, but you don't need it, you'll be comfortable. And they'll say, yeah, but we want it anyway. So we'll say, well, how about we leave room for it in case we need it down the road? So that's often the kind of thing we would do. So often they'll agree to that.
Okay, it's 9:45. Do we want to continue asking some questions? Yes? Yes? Okay, continue.
Okay, yeah. Hi there.
The city of Edmonton was completely on board with any idea that you would have. Could you tell us what your vision would be for the Rossdale power plant?
Oh, interesting. Good question. I think what the Rossdale power plant really needs to be is a contemporary Aboriginal gathering place and art center. And I think there is a really neat kind of set of connections with the Aboriginal community, both historically in terms of what that site was, contemporary in terms of Aboriginal culture, and future in terms of, there's actually, for example, Peace Hills Trust has a big collection of First Nations art that doesn't get shown anywhere because there's no gallery to show it, contemporary art. So I'm not talking about sort of a historical museum in the way of, you know, what the Provincial Museum has or the Royal Alberta Museum, but I'm talking about a contemporary cultural and art center for to sort of integrate First Nations realities today with the larger community. So that would be my vision. And I think there's lots of other potential visions, but I think that's one that could be really, really interesting, and could be pretty stimulating. Yeah. Sorry, can you speak? It's still in its infancy. The idea of reuse and using existing materials and using existing resources and using existing buildings is definitely not what most architects think about first. Architecturally, it's definitely, the tendency is still, well, we got to get rid of that old thing and start fresh. But we're starting to shift the paradigm. So that's really part of what our reimagine strategy is about starting a conversation across the country and saying, this is important. It's not just a random accident. It's something that we should be really striving for. Yeah?
Do you know if reuse and sustainability are taught in schools to help young architects?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, we have some architectural students here. Greg, what do you think? What's your take? Aha, okay, so maybe you could answer that, because I mean, Greg is a student who's working in our office right now. I don't know if there's other architecture students in the room, but...
Yeah, I'm going to Dell, and they're pretty good about talking about sustainability and examples of that. I think sustainability as reuse and as renovation is a whole different topic, and it's much less talked about. It's not discouraged, though, and I've done 2 of my projects last year very much on that theme. So at least my school is quite receptive to it, because it's quite obviously sustainable. It's easy to make an argument for it. But I think often it would be you as the student saying, I want to look into this. I think there's merit to this. And certainly sustainability in general and better energy efficient buildings are being talked about. But this in particular is, again, still in infancy, early stages.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that we do at Manasc Isaac is always sort of lead the conversation, right? That's just kind of our place in the world. So we start the conversation and then we get other people excited about it, and then little by little the schools will be talking about it. When Greg goes back to school, he'll be telling all his teachers that this is what's happening, and so they'll sort of clue in and they'll go, really, we should be talking about that, and eventually they will. So good question.
Any last words, Vivian?
Last words. Well, thank you so much for coming. We're excited as architects to be thinking about the future of our cities, the future of our communities, and the future of our working environments and our learning environments and all the cool places that we hang out. There's really, it's an endless adventure, the world of architecture. It's endlessly challenging, complicated, and interesting. And we love to have you along for the journey. So thank you for joining us.